Hi guys, my name's Tim Moen. I'm the leader of the Libertarian Party Canada. I hope you guys are doing well. Buckle in because we are going to go through a tour of the Liberal government's 2018 federal budget. Now, normally I don't comment very much on budgets. To me it's kind of like commenting on how the mafia spends its money after it steals it from me. I don't really care how they spend my money once they steal it from me. I just want them to stop stealing it from me. But in this case, I'm making an exception because I think the Liberals have found a way to not only steal our money, but use it in ways that will further harm Canadian interests. Now, there are 5 chapters to the budget: growth, progress, reconciliation, advancement, and equality. That's a pretty word salad, isn't it? So 3 of the 5 chapters are actually synonyms pretty much: growth, progress, advancement. So that's great. I guess we can expect hope and change, right? All right, let's get through this. So chapter 1 is growth. Now here the Liberals make sure that you know that they will be providing more subsidies for single mothers. So I guess we can expect the number of fatherless children to increase. That won't cause an increase in violent or suicidal males. I'm sure fatherlessness has nothing to do with school shootings, right? So obviously you get more of what you pay for. That's the first rule of subsidies. Here's a quote from chapter 1. The lack of affordable and accessible childcare in many communities means that for too many women, it just doesn't make financial sense to return to work after parental leave ends. This puts a strain on families whose budgets rely on the support that 2 incomes can provide, and deprives Canadian workplaces of the talent, skills, and insights that working mothers bring to their jobs. So how about this as an alternative to the idea of, subsidizing motherless children? How about you just lower our damn taxes? In Canada, we're taxed at nearly 50% when you add in all the tax: sales tax, gasoline tax, carbon tax, income tax. There's 1,000 taxes, and the government takes nearly half of our income. So yeah, of course, 2 of us have to go out and work to pay the darn bills, right? What would happen if we just lowered the tax rate so that only one person could go out and work and support a family? Of course, the government here doesn't want that. They want to tax livestock. They want you both getting out there and being productive so that they can milk you. And then on the flip side, they want you separated from your children, so they put the children in government schools where they're taught the virtues of big government. So it's a double whammy for them, isn't it? I mean, they separate you from your kids, increase their power, and they get to milk you more. So thanks, government. The next, they talk about more secure pensions. Right. So they're lowering the retirement age back to 65 and increasing the payout by 50% because apparently we can afford the boomer pensions now. Look, the CPP is predicated on constant growth of upcoming generations. So we don't have a very high birth rate anymore. This Ponzi scheme is going to collapse. This is why the retirement age was raised to 67. Original contributors to old age security got back 17 times what they put into the system. And millennials can expect to get 2/3 back of what they put into the system. But I guess that's fine as long as boomers can live in comfort. Am I right? So we talk about millennials being the entitled class. Well, I think this budget makes it clear that there's a different entitled class, and that is maybe the boomers who want to live a comfortable lifestyle. I mean, those are the ones that people that are going to be voting for Liberals. But the other thing we could do is just import a whole bunch of cheap labor into this country, import a bunch of people that will vote Liberal, and maybe they'll look after our retirements. Now, the other thing they're doing is building a bunch of affordable housing, which essentially means stealing from you and giving it to people who aren't you so that they can have better housing. Because public housing projects work and rent control work out great, don't they? Yeah, circumventing the law of supply and demand and stealing from productive people has no negative unintended consequences. The next thing that liberals are going to do is address the gender pay gap. Here's what they say. The reasons behind the gender wage gap are deep-rooted and complex. Closing the gap will require leadership and a comprehensive approach involving multiple tools. Well, all the research shows that the wage gaps are almost entirely due to the decisions that individuals make. It turns out that if you're a woman, you tend to make different decisions on average than if you are a man. So I'm not sure what the liberals are saying here. Is it that we have to get women to make the same types of decisions men make? That we have to eliminate gender differences where every person makes the same types of decisions? Like don't have kids, take on more dangerous and dirty jobs, work more hours, be a better tax livestock. I can't imagine indoctrinating people into the idea that there are no gender differences will have any negative consequences. On the other hand, maybe they're saying men need to pay women who choose to have kids, who choose not to take on dangerous or dirty jobs, who work fewer hours. So we should punish men for the decisions that women make. Now, by this logic, we should close the gender occupational death gap where, over 90% of workplace fatalities are male by ensuring an equal number of women are killed. It's ridiculous logic and reasoning. Look, this is 2018. Is there any woman out there who feels like she is not allowed to work 60 to 80 hours a week to clean out sewers and work on fishing boats, to build houses and oil refineries? Anyone? Are there any women who feel they're not free to go pursue those jobs? I don't think so. So, to recap, the message here for women from the liberals is either have more fatherless children, or stay barren and childless and work more for the government, or get married, have your kids institutionalized in our government schools so that you can get out into the workforce and pay for all the spending in our budget while your kids get indoctrinated into all the virtues of big government. Sounds like a great deal for everyone. But what's not on the table is, hey, we're going to tax you less and not try and manipulate incentives. That would be a liberal's worst nightmare. I mean, it might result in people freely choosing to get married, have kids, and get by on a single income while one parent stays at home and nurtures our most precious resource. That would take all the power out of the hands of the progressive elite who love to centrally control everything with their giant intellects and huge hearts, wouldn't it? Then on page 68 of the budget, we have a commitment from the liberals to crack down on tax evaders. You see, the tax evaders are the ones harming our economy by avoiding being plundered by our government. Here's an idea. How about you just stop stealing from us? That might have a positive effect on the economy. But no, apparently the liberals, to liberals, avoiding taxes is limiting economic growth, like avoiding extortion from the mafia doesn't hurt people, it hurts the mafia. Okay, chapter 2, progress. All right, we're getting somewhere now. We're advancing, progress. There's some growth here. This chapter basically goes on about all the science funding. Of course, like every chapter in this budget, the liberals make sure they focus on the genitalia of scientists because that is the most important factor in determining how grant money is allocated. And I'm going to go ahead and guess that just like all government funding on climate change research, 100% of the money is going to go to research that is fixated on all the problems associated with climate change. And none of the money is going to go to researchers in the vein of, say, Craig Idso, who studies some of the positive greening effects of climate change. We wouldn't want to know what opportunities a changing climate might present to Canadians, would we? how much more arable land are we going to have? Do we need to consider a land rush to more northern regions and an expanded agricultural sector? We'll never know, because those kind of funding studies will never get funded. Like, imagine what would happen if the federal government started handing out research money to scientists who could figure out scientifically all the ways that Toronto sucks, and zero money to scientists who could scientifically demonstrate all the ways Toronto is awesome. What would the scientific consensus about Toronto be if that were the case? I suspect we'd have a lot of peer-reviewed research proving how bad the Leafs suck, wouldn't we? I predict here that we are going to see a lot of peer-reviewed research explaining how climate change is a catastrophe and extremely patriarchal, and lots of support about how the government needs to plunder you to solve this problem. All right, Chapter 3, Reconciliation. This is the Liberal attempt to essentially solve problems that Indigenous people face by throwing more money at those problems. Never mind the fact that they can't figure out what is happening to all the dead and missing Indigenous women despite spending inordinate amounts of money on that inquiry. Never mind that they aren't even counting missing Indigenous men because they have the wrong type of genitalia, even though I've heard from a few First Nation chiefs and an independent researcher that the numbers of men missing are even higher than the numbers of women missing. But no one's even counting them in the government. They don't care about them. They got the wrong genitalia. But here's an idea. How about, instead of spending a bunch of money on worthless programs, we give First Nations people true sovereignty in their own territory? Why should the government have the right to invade their territory and strip mine the resources from it without their consent? Let's give them sovereignty and property rights, and let First Nations in places like Fort McMurray, in the Fort McMurray region, develop or not develop the resources under their feet, like the oil sands. Or in Northern Ontario, we have the, what's it called, the Ring of Fire, where there's billions or trillions of dollars of precious metals and resources under their feet. Allow them to live like Saudi princes, or to live a subsistence life off the land if they prefer a more traditional approach. But the point is, let them determine their destiny rather than continually trying to keep them dependent. And you know, instead of you know, breaking their legs continually and then handing them taxpayer-funded crutches with a smug "you're welcome," how about we just not break their legs in the first place? That might be a good idea to start. So how about a little bit more liberty for those people rather than more dependency and handouts? Chapter 4, Advancement. Ooh, we're advancing. Here, the Liberals talk about the best way to avoid a dangerous climate, and that's by making it very difficult for you to use fossil fuels, which is the one thing protecting Canadians from a dangerous climate. They also gleefully explain all the cronyism and corporate welfare spending they're going to engage in by funding so-called clean energy projects. Then the next thing you can applaud the Liberals for is spending $2 billion of your hard-earned money advancing feminism around the world, as well as something called United Nations Agenda 2030, which is essentially a globalist policy that strips smaller jurisdictions of their sovereignty and attempts to put control in the hands of a central cabal of progressive elites. Sounds wonderful, isn't it? Let's give them all the power to run the world. Then we get to something that's near and dear to my heart, the opioid crisis. Here the Liberals talk about increasing the $38 billion they steal from taxpayers in exchange for long healthcare lineups by another $1.4 billion to deal with the opioid crisis. Now, as a firefighter paramedic, I work on the front line of this crisis. I regularly deal with people who have overdosed or died from opiates. I've been personally exposed to fentanyl on the job, and I can tell you it's a bloody mess out there. But the government has created this crisis. You know, up until a few years ago, if you wanted to get high on opiates, you could do it relatively safely by convincing a physician you were in pain and getting a prescription for Oxy 80s or something similar. Now, these tablets were easily crushable, and then you could snort the powder and get high with a relatively safe and known dose of narcotic. Then the government made it much harder for physicians to prescribe these drugs. At the same time, they mandated pharmaceutical manufacturers make crush-proof opiates so you couldn't crush them and snort them. Now, do you think that this dealt in any way with the demand for opiates? No. It just drove the suppliers underground. So now an unscrupulous person can ship fentanyl in from China, which is a super potent narcotic in very small quantities. So it's impossible to stop the smuggling of the stuff because you can just import pinches of the stuff, and it's impossible for customs officials to find it. And so now what happens is you have these enterprising dealers making pills out of fentanyl that look just like the Oxy 80s everyone wants. The problem is that the potency of the fentanyl and the shoddy nature of these clandestine labs make it difficult to get the dose of fentanyl right in each tablet. So if you get one of these fraudulent Oxy 80s, one of them might have absolutely no effect because there's no traces of fentanyl in there. There's just talcum powder or something like that. And so you crush up a couple more, and maybe the next one kills you because it's got a hot spot of fentanyl, because these dealers, in clandestine labs aren't known for their quality control. Now, the answer to this problem, like so many other problems we face in Canada, is liberty. You own your body. Let users have a safe pathway to get the medication they want from someone who's accountable for the product they sell. Someone like a physician or a pharmacist who are accountable, who are held liable for what they sell. Drug dealers aren't held liable. They have no quality control. They don't face getting run out of business and having their careers and lives destroyed if they sell a fraudulent or poisonous product. And then there's the fact that drug legalization has been shown to dramatically decrease crime rate and addiction rates in jurisdictions like Portugal, who have decriminalized or legalized these products. So imagine that. Self-sovereignty leads to better results. Now, we could talk at length about the number of ways that government programs increase addiction rates that I won't get into. Certainly subsidizing fatherlessness is one way to increase addiction rates, but there are hundreds of more ways that the government is doing this. But to suffice it to say that more liberty, not more plunder, and government programs is the only path forward. It's not going to be perfect. There's no such thing as utopia or perfection. We're still going to deal with addiction and overdose, but we don't need to add fuel to the fire, which is exactly what the government is doing. Okay, the final chapter is equality. Great. Again, here we have the Liberals making a case to get more women in the workforce because it increases GDP, see? The translation is that it increases the amount of tax livestock that the government can milk. There's a lot to say about using GDP as a primary goal of government policy. For example, is it better to have a culture and a society where children are nurtured because a parent can stay at home? Or is it better for a nation to have a slightly higher GDP because you can get mom out into the workforce? There are also some real problems using GDP as a measure of economic health. When your GDP goes up because people get sick or injured and thus health spending goes up, you ought to take the metric with a tiny grain of salt. This is kind of Keynesian thinking, right? And by a Keynesian's definition, an economy improves if you break all the windows in a city. So breaking windows results in more spending at window shops, window manufacturers, and repair companies. And this is known as the broken window fallacy and ought to be debunked on the first day of economics class. The thing that this fallacy fails to account for is the unseen opportunity cost. Every dollar spent on fixing broken windows is a dollar not spent on more productive means that it would otherwise have been spent on: investing, saving, capital investment. So, in fact, breaking windows harms the economy. It doesn't help the economy. Imagine that. It takes, this should be something that's patently obvious to everyone, that you don't go around breaking stuff to improve the economy. And so, the liberals need to read some Bastiat, some von Mises, some Hayek, some Friedman, or any other free market economist here, and have this line of thinking debunked. Now, the liberals also voiced their concern about the number of women in trades here as well. They want to implement programs and spending that see more women get into dangerous jobs, and they're willing to spend all sorts of money to get women into these dangerous jobs. So they simply can't imagine why a woman might choose a different job or want to be a stay-at-home mom. Now, it has to be the patriarchy here at work. All right, then they get down to another problem, right? So they make a big note that 72% of homeless shelter users are men and only 27% are women. Okay, are they identifying a problem about men here? No, the problem here in their eyes is that this indicates an obstacle for women to get into shelters. They never stop to imagine that maybe there's reasons why men have higher rates of homelessness. No, clearly this is the patriarchy at work again. It couldn't have anything to do with the fact that, men are expected to go to war, and that breaking of veterans by our government foreign policy is then left unaddressed when they get home. It couldn't be that by the time males are 2 years old, they are essentially told to suck it up, buttercup, when they're struggling in life. It couldn't be that men are more isolated and alone in a culture that views them as resource objects to be exploited. Couldn't be that men are not as likely to get help getting back on their feet as women are. Nope, it's got to be the patriarchy that is keeping women from having access to shelters. Never mind that there's only one shelter in Canada that houses male victims of domestic violence, even though men report being victims of domestic violence at the same rate as women. So there it is, a whirlwind tour of the budget from a libertarian perspective. I read it, so you don't have to. In summary, not only can you expect to be plundered to a greater degree, you can expect that the money will be put to good use, making things worse for every Canadian equally. Peace.